All right. So we have a bunch of questions from various people as well as the questions we came up with, and we have them kind of grouped. So the first one we have is from TJ MacArthur, and he asks, what does this discourse and terminology actually add to the practice of witchcraft beyond academic distinctions? I think that is a pretty good starting point because it's kind of asking like why even talk about this or bring it up at all. I have some thoughts on that, but does anyone else want to take a first crack at that one?
Yeah, I'll do it. It adds functionality and folkloric relevance to the entire conversation. I mean, asking that is like asking, what is the discussion about fast twitch and slow twitch muscle bring to the martial arts of any kind? I mean, it's quite literally, can your etheric body move better and faster and more effectively than a person's etheric body who doesn't have either the legacy or the trained capacity to do these things? So one would argue that that discussing this would, in my opinion, give a bridge of hope to practitioners who, frankly, suck at magic at this point and want to stop doing that, but also who want to explain why some people just have impossible good luck in life. I mean, this can explain more than just what is this practitioner doing. This is also like, why does Todd, the dickhead who works at the dealership, never suffer from the consequences of his actions ever and only seem to fail upward as though he is blessed by heaven? And it's because, well, in a sense, my boy Todd is,
Mhm.
you know?
Yeah, I agree. And I think the other part of it is on the other end, right? For people, especially like young people who are coming up like real, like whatever we want to call it, like they've got a lot of witch fire in them from birth. They're like having these experiences and like without a conversation about that, like you're just crazy, right?
Yeah,
Like having that conversation about like how some people are just sort of like born extra weird and born to be magicians. Like, I wish somebody had told me that at 9 instead of me just being like, it took a long time to come to that conclusion on my own.
yeah. I think that the understanding being born weird is a big part of talking about it. For me, with talking about this more publicly, that's been a really fulfilling part is having people who they were like, oh, yeah, no, this matches my experience, but I never really knew how to understand it. And even in like magical or neo pagan spaces, felt kind of on the outside because no one talks about this.
Yeah.
I think from a practical perspective, almost like the flip side of what Alex was saying that like there's going to be some people where it's just they seem to be better at these things naturally. I think recognizing what that is can help you sort out that there's going to be things that maybe work that shouldn't work or that like other people encounter and they're like, well, you've got to do magic this way because it's you need these things to make it work. And then you have some people who can stumble through making things work that are just messy or not fully put together or where like pieces of it don't seem like they make sense even from a magic perspective and you can get kind of trapped with that where if you've got this kind of natural talent and you can make stuff work then you feel like you can always just sort of wing it without realizing that okay, that's because you have this natural talent, not because this is just how it works all the time. And if you go and you learn some of the systematic and formal ways, that's going to deepen that and improve that as well. I think also in terms of like just the differences in the etheric body, depending on the way in which that talent is manifest or created, it does actually change your interaction with the spirit world and your perceptions of the spirit world and your interactions with different types of magical faculties and how you interact with materials, how you interact with the targets of your magic, how you can connect with them, and being able to tap into that and that sort of different shape of being that witches have that gives you some practical elements that you wouldn't necessarily understand or comprehend or be able to explore as deeply if you didn't know this was something on the table to look at. Like you'd kind of be fumbling around with these things that feel sort of innate and feel sort of natural, but without a way of actually systematizing how to use them and how to explore them. And so I think that's the benefit of talking about it. But I think going into the actual like practical differences, it's the way that you're able to connect with the object of your magic, the way that you're able to connect with the materials you're using and the spirits you're working with differs and is a more close and direct connection as opposed to I'm standing over here, the spirits are standing over there, and the person that I'm targeting is standing way over there. It's like everything's brought together in the middle, in from this perspective. Allison, did you have
I
anything
mean,
you wanted to?
honestly, like you and Sarah really covered what I was going to say about, it being a lived experience that can be very confusing for people if they don't know what's the situation. And I felt like that until I, got old enough to like make friends that also had these same experiences. One of whom is Sarah.
I was gonna say that, like, one of the first, like, I feel really lucky because I did grow up with another like witch-blooded co-magician that I met in Girl Scouts when we were 8. But like Allie is definitely one of the first like serious magicians who was like both witch-blooded and like a magic nerd that I met. And I'm so happy I met you. We were, I don't know, 20-ish at that
Yeah,
point.
it was a long time ago.
Yeah, I think kind of in my teen years, the spaces on the internet that I was had a lot of people from those sorts of backgrounds, which also I think can you've got like the positive end of like, okay, you've got a friend who is into these same things and has the same kind of experience, but then like you also there's kind of the negative end where like being thrown to those spaces, you sometimes have people who are like way more intense about some of the magic stuff that they're doing, and are open to a lot of stuff that like just in the 90s and early 2000s was just not on the table for like what most people would think was acceptable or what most people would do with magic. And being like a teenager in those environments and interacting with those
Yeah,
people, it was very beneficial, but also a little wild sometimes.
agree.
Okay, so then our next question comes from Halo Quinn, who asks where the terms witchblood and witchfire originated, how they evolved, what traditions use these terms, and what do we mean when we use them? Anyone want to take a first stab at that?
Yeah, I'll go for it. So, starting with Witchfire specifically, in the current era, the year of our Lord 2025, a lot of initiatory witch lineages, Trinidadian Obeah, for example, the Benedante lineage in North Italy specifically, and several tantric lineages, most specifically in North India, and southern Nepal that I'm aware of, and have had the opportunity to train in. We'll talk about this as a thing passed from either spirit to person or person to person, either by birth or by ritual activity, typically revolving around an ordeal if you didn't have it. It's also a thing where if you were born this way, born special by their definition, and you're given these things, the ordeal will be extremely mild because you've already been. It's sort of just slotting more of what you've already got into you. But if you don't, you can be made this way, and if you survive the ordeal, and some of these witch lineages are more intense than others, some have a body count for the initiation, some functionally don't. But it's referred to as a witch fire for two reasons. One, because fire spreads. You can, light a candle off another candle. That's an image often used in some of these things, and because you are trained to imagine it as a light or a fire that moves through you. It's part of the internal training, the cultivation exercises that typically come with them to move. Now, in terms of the witch blood thing, I think that I don't know etymologically where the first way you're looking at it, but I mean it's a lineage reference. Obviously, it's the you come by it honestly, right? Like your folks are weird, you're weird, or something happened to your mom in when she was pregnant, or she had a vision of the Virgin Mary, or whatever, and you came out weird. It's in the blood, and the assumption is also not just that any kids you produce are going to be weird, but also your blood itself is just weird. Like your fluids are weird. The relics from your body are strange, which is why people will, dig up a witch's grave for those bones because that shit slaps, allegedly. I'm just saying, I wouldn't do that. because I'm a good Catholic boy. But if I wasn't, I'd at least think about it.
Yeah, I think for me, like the question of like where these words came from, came up last spring when some people were not too happy about the term witchblood. And there were even people who thought that like I had made up this term, and it's like no, it's a term I grew up with. Like I knew it growing up, and so to me, it's very familiar. I did go back and check the Google Ngram thing, and it seems like the earliest published uses of it were like 1950s or 1960s or something, but it's all over modern witchcraft literature. It's not something that shows up in like your ceremonial magic or your grimoire literature or anything like that. And I think that's where some people have missed it. But yeah, I have no idea how old either term is. Witchfire to me feels like a newer term. I feel like that's one I've only heard in the last few years. Um,
Because I
but
understand
that,
it's newer in the Anglophone world.
yeah,
I actually feel the opposite. I feel like I grew up like in my early days of magic practice with like witchfire as a thing, which at least at the time, like I understand witchfire and witchblood to be related but not identical
yeah,
terms. Like I do think of witchblood as being primarily like about it being inheritable, right? And so like when we were kids, we used to call it the witch gene. Like it's a witch gene. Like it was obvious that it ran in families. Everybody knew that, right? But there was this additional thing that was witchfire, which was more about like it varied more over time, right? Like you could be higher witchfire or lower witchfire, and some people had either no or maybe just a little pilot like kind of witchfire, and some people were on fire with witchfire, which was not necessarily good either,
yeah,
right? And so I think of witchfire as like the power in you that when you're doing magic that like you're powering just out of your you-ness, it's the thing that powers that. And I understand witchblood to be like sort of a propensity for being high witchfire. Like both that you are naturally high witchfire and that like when you spend your witchfire, it replenishes rapidly. I get, but I'm not saying other people. That's just how I understand those words, rather than in some kind of like sort of specific or tradition specific sense. When I use them, that's what I.
yeah. To me, I tend to think of witch blood more as being the condition that, and that's like it definitely implies the hereditary element, but that I would say someone who has acquired it through a non-hereditary means, like they were born at a certain time or they had a certain spirit relationship that created it, that they still have witch blood, but I think it becomes something that's inheritable from them at that point. And I tend to think of witch fire as the actual active energetic principle that carries through that blood or that is there sort of infecting them and warping and changing them. That it's one is like the energy and one is the state.
I could see that.
Yeah.
As far as traditions, it seems like you do get these terms used in some of the modern tradcraft um, approaches. I feel like I've seen Witchblood a little bit more there and seen Witchblood a little bit even out of some of the older Gardnerian stuff. Um, and then it seems like the fairy trad people, they tend to use both terms frequently. I've seen both come up with them in terms of the question of like what traditions use these terms. I think Alex, you covered some of the more traditional approaches attached to different cultures, uh, as opposed to like some of the modern traditions. But yeah, I feel like a lot of people coming out of like a fairy influence background, I've seen use these terms a lot, and some of the early foundational Gardnerians use these, at least use the witchblood term. I don't know if they use witchfire. So, if we don't have anything else for that question, then I guess we can move on to the next one. If people are good.
Yeah, that works.
Okay. So Archie asks what it means that the witch exists in a supernatural state and how supernatural is that state. So I guess I'll tackle this one initially because I know he's kind of responding off of me talking about this supernatural state idea. And I think that really digs into, in a modern sense, a lot of times we're very focused on the idea that there is no supernature. There's nothing that's supernatural. Everything is part of nature. And I remember being like 11 or 12 and reading Scott Cunningham and thinking, whoa, and just like blowing my mind the idea that none of this was supernatural, that it's all natural. Um, and it's kind of like a cool perspective, but it definitely ignores that historically people did think of there as being things that were part of their normal natural experience and the things that were other things that were separate from that. And even looking at Hermeticism, you have sort of like nature as the physical world, and then you have the spiritual world on top of that, and humans are a combination of that spiritual world and that physical natural world. So there is an element of human experience that is supernatural in general. And there's an element of the spirit world that is not fully tied to the earthly nature of the physical world. And I think when we say that the witch is supernatural, we're talking about the fact that the witch has a foot in both worlds. The witch, depending on what the nature of the powers that are witching a person are, they might be connected with the world of the dead. They might be connected with the world of the fairies or with worlds of nature spirits or connected in general through multiple of those spaces. But they've got a portion of themselves that is tied to their human physical being and a portion that is very rooted in those other spaces and those other types of beings. And they may exist in a kind of chimerical way where elements of their existence and their nature are drawn more or more similar to some of those other types of beings, which creates kind of like the warpy glitchiness that may be what creates witchcraft in them in general. So it's that partial existence as being other and being tied to those supernatural spaces that makes the witch supernatural in my interpretation of it. But some of you guys might have some other thoughts around that too.
Yeah, so I just want to, I'm going to push back a little bit because I am actually on team. There's no such thing as supernatural. There's just nature, and nature is deeply complex. And I do think that, like, the clean division between natural and supernatural, between mundane reality and the spirit world, I do think that that's more culturally determined than otherwise, right? So, like, in Judaism, I don't think even relatively, like, rationalist modern rabbis, I think they would all argue that, like, actually everyone has a foot in both the, I don't really like the words natural and supernatural, so I'm gonna use visible and invisible worlds, right? And that, like, the nature of, like, witchy folk generally is that they have extra access to that invisible world, like things they are in, they have a sensory access to things that other people don't have sensory access to, right? More so than, but other people, those things are still occurring to them. They're just oblivious to it, right? So there's a story that, like, when Moses found the burning bush, there's a midrash, like a folkloric story, that basically says that that bush had been on fire the whole fucking time. But Moses was just, like, always his head up in the clouds, or, like, always his head down in his work, and not actually present in the world around him, and so missing it. And I would come down more on that side, right? That I don't think there is a clean division between natural and supernatural, but that what makes something witchy is not their otherness relative to nature, but their otherness relative to human culture, right? That, like, being a witch is about being weird relative to humans, not weird relative to nature more broadly, and specifically weird relative to humans, like modern civilized humans, for whatever that is. But that is not to say that other cultures don't have this same role for somebody. They're like, oh yeah, that dude's real fucking weird and he talks to trees and dead people and they talk back, and that's weird, right? But I do think that, like, the weirdness is more about the visibility of it than it happening, right? That, like, the dead are also acting on non-witches. Non-witches are simply unaware of that fact. right? Or that the angels are also delivering messages to non-witches. Non-witches just my mother would have said very judgmentally that like God talks to everyone and most people aren't listening. But I think it would be fairer to say that most people can't hear.
Yeah, I think that makes sense as a way to frame it. Like,
So I don't know. My answer to the question is always one of aspect and contact. So a story I often like to tell about Allison is if you've ever been in a car with Allison, she actively does pass like by nature things that tantric practitioners will spend years learning how to do so the traffic around her will move. And it's a thing that I've observed and other people have observed so many times. And I mean, I'll be having a conversation with her in the car about something entirely unrelated, and you'll feel it if you are tuned in, and you'll be like, "Wow, you moved that person. You did these things." And it's like the elements don't affect you in the same way. And I would argue that having natural witchcraft is the etheric equivalent of having like naturally good biorhythm and being able to do a fucking backflip without explaining like how you just Spider-Maned your way into doing a backflip. A childhood friend of mine, his name was Rob. He could just do shit like that, and he didn't even know how. You'd be like, "How did you do that?" He'd go, "Oh, I just did it. Like I just wanted to do it, and I willed myself to do it." Is essentially what he would say. And I've noticed that very witch-blooded people will be able to do the same thing. Like, oh well, like again, I'm going to use Todd at the dealership as an example because I've always wanted to bring up the point that the people you don't want to have witch blood could also and often do have that. So like another example from my life, there was this guy I knew. He was a fucking he looked like a foot with eyes. Like this man was a creature. Like I'm a creature, but he was a creature, you know what I'm saying? And like he was remarkably not just romantically but socially and financially successful. And he was, a complete alcoholic, a complete fuck up. And I asked him once at a bar, "How the fuck do you do that?" And I knew the answer, but he went, "Nah, you're gonna think it's dumb." I'm like, "Don't tell me." He goes, "Okay. You know how like when you're like about to fall asleep, you feel kind of floaty?" And I'm like, "Sure, yeah." He's like, okay, so it's going to sound stupid, but every time I've really wanted something, I just pretended really hard like I had it, and then it would always happen. And sometimes when I'm talking to people, I like pretend like I'm them, and they're responding to me the way I would want that. He didn't obviously, speak as well as I'm speaking right now because he was plastered, but he would say that. I'm like, "Hey, you figured out how to do these things because you have the gift." It's like when people read Neville Goddard. They're like, "Why can't I manifest like Neville Goddard?" I'm like, Neville Goddard was witch-blooded, a method actor, and also psychotic. Remarkably successful, and the receipts exist for this man's freakish success during the Great Depression and beyond. But like, he just, he just had the gift, and it's just that thing.
Question. I don't know who Neville Goddard is.
He's a new thought guy that people love, and his whole thing is he's like, he has the most bafflingly frustrating instructions if you aren't witch-blooded. Where he's like, just live in the end. Like, just assume it's already happened. Because God loves you the best. Well, maybe God did love you the best, Neville, my guy, because maybe you were born special. But if you look at his history, everything just laid out for this motherfucker because he was able to pretend. Mitch Horowitz is a big thing. And Mitch Horowitz is also witch-blooded as dick. Let's be real. Like, he's just like, "Yeah, I just pretend and shit just happens." And I'm like, "Yeah, you maybe." So I would argue the supernatural, if we're going to use that aspect of it, is your ability to access these states is reflexive rather than having to be trained.
Agree. And also, I do think there's an element of being well favored on the other side, whatever that means.
Sure,
like,
one could argue that.
I think that like the gods play favorites.
Well, that's why people say like, they have the gift or they're gifted at that. And again, the thing that I always like to push back with this conversation with people who get mad at it is like, nobody looks at Jimi Hendrix and has a problem going, "Yeah, that dude was just born for this shit. Like he was just gifted." Nobody looks at Bruce Lee and goes, "Yeah, no, I refuse to admit that man was like genetically blessed to be a groundbreaking martial artist."
Right.
But people will look at this because it's ephemeral, and because, frankly, I think that in the modern age, so many people want it who probably can't have it because either now, and again, as an educator of magic, I will always say there's a way to get there. You just don't want it bad enough to do the crazy thing that it would require. But if you want it, folklore will tell you you can have nothing, go do some wild shit, and come back with everything.
Mm-hmm.
But you got to want it.
Yeah.
But people don't want to have that. They're like, well, that person was born special and that person wasn't. Well, that person was born wealthy and beautiful, and you were a goblin. It was poor. You can still work harder and have the thing.
Yeah.
So that's my TED talk on that one.
I think you're gonna say, Sarah.
Well, and I'm just going to highlight what Alex said. I think that sometimes the kind of magical education that like I came up with, like in the 90s, was very big on like, oh, everybody can do this. And it wasn't until later when I was teaching math that I kind of came to understand that that's like really a cruel thing to teach. Like when I'm teaching math, I think it did all of my students, both the math-blooded ones and the very much not math-blooded ones. It did all of them good for me to be like, hey guys, I'm math-blooded. Like I'm made for this and I'm really good at this. And so like, here's how I do it. But you don't have to be held to that standard. Like I watched so many students like who did want it really bad and who were willing, who were like crying, like torturing themselves into tears every day for years over it, often with a lot of torture help from their parents. And they just weren't gonna get it. And I think it is unwise and cruel to suggest that just like I'm never gonna be a brilliant musician, like I can't carry a tune in a bucket with two hands. Like I'm not for that. I'm never gonna be a star basketball player. So I think it's not just about like having the gift, it's this realization that like different people are good at different things, and magic is a very big like thing. So there are a lot of different gifts you can make relevant to it. Like I would not necessarily come down on the idea that all four of us have identical gifts. Like we don't have the same witch blood, right? There's like lots of different kinds, and also lots of kinds of magic that aren't as reliant, right? So like some kinds of magic I think are not particularly reliant on witch blood / witchfire, but still benefit from it.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean,
right. But I do think, yeah.
One could argue the entire grimoire tradition and its analogs in Eastern culture are like that. Like, for example, if you now I'm not a part of the Taoist lineage, but I know plenty,
Sure.
And they'll say like, oh yeah, we have all these internal practices that can get you there, but like, and that's another thing actually, they'll do it in a classroom setting where they'll be like, do you have clairsentience? Can you feel this energy? Yes. Go over here. No, go over here and do 20 hours of cumulative training until you can. And
right.
If you can't, then you have to leave. But if you're already here, cool, then you go to the next thing and the next thing. But
exactly.
Their equivalent of like grimoire magic in Goetia is very similar because they'll ask you, did you do all the cultivation stuff and how good were you at what level? And then, okay, cool, this is how then you must do this or you can do this. But if you got nothing, okay, then you got to do the fasting and the prayers and the heaven Buddha mantras like 20,000 times over the course of a week and all this stuff. And then you can do the same thing. It's how much do you need? Now, I would argue that in Western culture, my spicy take is that we never actually lost that. It just nobody wrote it down and nobody talked about it in public discourse, but privately, the magic people I've known over the course of my life that I've been fortunate enough to know, the families that I've known, will discuss it in extremely identical ways. Oh, do you have the site? No? Okay, cool. Then you must do this.
Right.
Or this is how you generate it. Now, one thing I will say that the Eastern traditions have is they do have the timelines pretty firm. They're like, can you see spirits at all? Nope. Are you willing to put 100 cumulative hours, roughly speaking, into this practice? If you are, then you will, with very few exceptions, be able to do this thing. Now, again, 100 cumulative hours is or isn't a lot depending on how you view it. I mean, you can crush that in less than a year if you're willing to sit there for an hour a day and do the thing.
Right. On the other hand, you could also spread it out over 5 years. And
and there are people who do that.
Exactly.
But that's the thing. But it's the question of like, how is it even framed? Because if you look at cultures that frame this in a more, I would say, sane and reasonable way, then you either have it or you don't. Now, that said, you could also bring up the fact that in most of history, hyper specialization was how humans lived. It
Mhm.
was like, oh, cool. Is that the kid who swings the stick the best in the village? That's a warrior. We're just going to put you in the thing. We're going to do it. Oh, cool. You could read faster than everybody else. Scribe time. Oh, cool. You can sing. Cool. Now you're a bard. And that was your life. We live in a time where we have the luxury of actually being able to stretch our capacities to be genuinely great at so many different things. And I fully believe that I'm a polymath enthusiast.
Mhm.
And I would argue that magic is within the purview of that. And I would also argue that
Right.
magic actually facilitates the quicker learning of things. And so would, I don't know, the Ars Notoria and also the entirety of Franz Barden's vaulting. But, um, what was I saying? Shit. Okay, yeah, no, so here, I got it. So the thing is, we as a culture, I think, need to be better at analyzing what gifts a person has and doesn't have. And we also need to be able to have, especially as magicians, especially as an educator of occultists, you need to
Mhm.
be the one who has to tell the hard thing to people like this. You just don't have it. Because I've had to tell people, truly teary eyed over Zoom, you have no functional magical gifts of any kind. And they're like, but I've been the high priestess of so and so for so long. And I'm like, you were lied to. Maybe you
Mhm.
lied to yourself. I'm very sorry. Here is a training program that you can do that if you have any gifts at all, will show you, but you need to really make peace with the fact that you may get radio silence. I've known, just like there are deaf people in the world who could never be a musician, there are people who got nothing when it
Mhm.
comes to this.
Yeah.
And as dark as it sounds, in a world that is unkind and profoundly unfair, which our world has always been and
Right.
always will be,
Agree.
people wanting to be special is an understandable natural reaction. But
Mm.
sometimes you have to accept the fact that, in my opinion, the coolest fucking thing in the world isn't for you. And you got to find out what the coolest thing in the world is for you because you're only going to bash your head against a wall for nothing, screaming into a void if you try to be something that you truly cannot be.
Right. Agree.
So I think there's a ton of things off of like all the stuff that have been said uh already. I think like I guess to go really far back to the question of supernatural, I think the framing culturally makes a lot of sense. I guess part of why I lean into the supernatural framing is the fact that witches in most cultures are described in a way which sound like you're not sure if you're talking about a human or you're talking about a fairy tale creature.
Do they be described that way, or do English speaking Westerners, when they translate it, describe it that way?
It's a fair point. It's a fair
I would,
point.
I would argue that a lot
But,
of the
I think some
boots
of
on,
both.
yeah,
but
I would
yeah,
argue, I would say it would depend on the culture because like
yeah.
boots on the ground Slavic culture absolutely describes inhuman beings. I would argue that, I would also argue that when we look at the medieval English speaking world, you can't even compare it to the current Anglophone world in terms of
Agree.
anything.
Yeah.
So the idea of like Merlin, a Cambion, a half demon, was
Hmm.
described. And again, a Cambion was, outside of even like the Malleus Maleficarum, was a concept of like, no, some people are just that thing
Yeah.
and that. Now, again, to set at the risk of falling into 2004 other conform territory, which is a problem,
Agree.
and I could opine for hours about that that circumstance. Historically speaking, and especially even in certain places in the world, particularly in terms of West African witchcraft, a good friend of mine, his name is Joel Adafon. Shout out to Joel. He has been boots on the ground with this thing. There's a lot of no, that person isn't human because they were born with a gift. And
I agree. I would argue that not being human is a very different claim than being supernatural. So, like in Judaism, we would definitely say that, right? That like certain kinds of sorcerers are like borderline not human, but angels are also not human. But that doesn't make them not part of a holistic, integrated creation.
sure. And as I understand it, and again, this is another thing I'm an expert on it all, so I might be wrong.
Right.
But depending on the culture, I think it would depend on how much of your socio-religious ideology is self versus other versus cosmology.
Agree.
Because if you look at certain communities where it's like for example, if you look at like a lot of folklore and American folk magic conjure specifically,
Hmm.
there's a big difference between Catholic Appalachian conjure in terms of how they view other than human beings and Georgia Protestant conjure. Just speaking of two of the ones that I've been trained in specifically, they look at things extremely differently, and you can trace that all the way back to like the colonial ancestry of both regions
Mm.
and their religiosity. Because in Catholicism, it's like, yeah, there are centaurs and they can become saints too, because fuck it, why not? Drinking isn't a sin, you know? Whereas you got Protestantism and they're like, that person has freckles. I will murder them.
Exactly. Yeah.
Again, full Protestant hater here. I don't pretend like I'm.
So I think the another thing that in terms of this idea of difference though is like we keep talking about it as having a gift or being special. But I think it's also there's a lot of cultures where this is a curse.
Mhm.
Where especially when you have things like in our own modern Anglophone culture where we've lost the language for talking about this.
I
Uh,
grew up assuming I was cursed.
yeah, like a lot of people treat it that way and think it's a thing that is a problem because they don't know how to channel it or how to interact with it. But um like in the one of the cultures that I've found kind of interesting to look at with this, the Niemba, they have two versions of being a witch. And one of them looks a lot like European witchcraft with night flights and things like that. But the other one's basically like a form of the evil eye that's based on having a demon grafted onto you. And they look at it as an unfortunate thing. Like they don't blame the people who have it. They don't think the people who have it are bad. It's just like bad things will happen because of those people, and it's not really their fault because they're kind of cursed. And having talked to some South American friends, they've encountered that same thing in some of the cultures there, where you'll have spirits that follow particular families or attached to particular families, and that creates different types of things that we might describe as gifts, but without the context or the language to utilize them positively, they're seen as a curse. And I think for all four of us, we kind of have been exposed to things that have allowed us to uh, work with these things well. And I think we all have variable experiences in terms of how involved our families were, connected our families were to these things. But I think all of us were at least better than some people are in that regard.
Mhm.
So we tend to lean into the, oh, a gift, being special and things like that. But it can also throw a lot of things off.
Yeah.
And I think that's when people are like, when people are trying to reject the idea and are like, "Oh, this is just people trying to be special. It's just trying to be people being special." It's like you got to remember, it's like there's a lot of bad shit that comes with this, depending on where you are and what you're exposed to and what the support network you have is. And even if you're in a place where it's like you're not going to be attacked or killed for being different, um, just being different and not understanding how or why you're different can be unnerving. Seeing spirits if you are not in a cultural context that accepts that, feeling the feelings or hearing thoughts from other people, like if you're not in a cultural context that shows you how to control that, can be incredibly overwhelming. Like I've met several people who like that was part of their witchfire, was that they could feel things from people and read things from people naturally. And it seems to be really common that somewhere around your teen years, if you learn some magic, you learn to shut that off and dampen those powers, because they are incredibly difficult to deal with if you don't have training on how to process that and use that. Um, but then kind of going back to that, the portion of the conversation about um, kind of what how things were described in like the 90s and people's perceptions about why they would reject these ideas of some people being different. I think some people, their worlds are just small, and that uh, there's a lot of people in the magic community who don't believe in magic and who feel safer and more comfortable if magic is something that is a psychological tool, or magic is something that is about having certain types of feelings after certain performative actions. And the idea of real spirits or real magical work that can impact the world can be terrifying. And if you open the world up and say like that exists, but on top of that existing, there's also people that have different relationships with that and different capabilities with that. And maybe some people have them and maybe some people don't. That's even more terrifying for people who feel left out of that. And I think there is a wide gamut of people who have like a little bit and people who have a lot. And then also, yeah, some people who might have none and people who are even dampeners against it. That there's a large range of different elements of this and different ways in which people can experience this and have it or not have it. And I think sometimes the idea of just treating it as a yes or no, it's on or it's off, people have it or they don't, that that kind of sets up that criticism. It's like, oh, this is just people trying to be special. And it's like, oh, this one, it can fucking suck sometimes. But also like, no, it's like you can have some people who they have it a little bit. And so there's ways they're drawn to this, ways they're able to do things. I think a lot of neo-pagan witchcraft kind of reflects that. And that's an idea that I've been coming around to a little bit more, is that I think a lot of that community probably has a lot of people who have it in some small level. And because there's a lot of things there that when you start exploring magic more deeply, some of the really basic stuff there doesn't make sense. And then you get a lot of people who are like, yeah, I tried that and it never worked for me, but I went and did these grimoires and that works great. And I think that gets to the idea that there's a diversity of magic also, that there's different types of magic, that like Alex, you were talking about like the grimoires as a separate mode. And I think that like they're definitely benefited from this, but I think like you have people where it's like you've got it, like you're different, you're weird, you're kind of a spirit person, you're kind of in the mix of that. Then you've got people where it's like you've got a little bit of it, and so you're going to still want the more formal things to do. And then you have people who just don't have it, and then like systems like the grimoires, they're ways that like you can use words of power and tools of power and special days and special times where everything except you has that connection and has that capability. And you are instrumentalizing those connections and capabilities for a bunch of other things in order to effectively do magic and interact with the spirit world. And then you can have people who it's like they don't even want to go through that level of development and training. They're going to go just buy some tools that are enchanted and then use that like almost like a storybook. And I mean, I think all of us have some things that we own that were created by someone on this call who makes magical items that work very well. And you could have somebody completely with no magic, as long as they aren't like a person that dampens magic, then they could take those things and be a magician without having to like go learn magic and do magic stuff, and without having to have it naturally. Where it's like if you've got the right set of tools that give you the right group of spirits that you can ask to do things, you can accomplish a range of magical stuff without ever learning magic, without having magic as a power you have. Then you have people who can learn it without having it as a power, and they pull together different things that allow them to be functional. And then you have people that are kind of like weirdly functional just naturally, but that can also trip them up. And so I think there's a range there that I think that's lost in the discussion a lot of times. And I think that kind of gets back to that like magic as someone naturally working magic with a bunch of tools versus magic as somebody who is maybe supernatural or maybe different or maybe some word to describe that as something outside of the norm.
I agree. I think also, the way our culture defines magic, we're really defining it in opposition to other things. Well, if it's not religion and it's not science and it's not art, it just lands in this bucket. So I think a lot of times, like, what we call magic is actually like a lot of largely unrelated things. You know what I mean? And I think that's a lot of like, we're talking about it as the gift, but there's a lot of different gifts for a lot of different things. And there are certain kinds of magic that like I have never had any success with. And there are certain kinds of like, there are certain people's magic also, like their stuff just, I don't know, we magic on different vibe frequencies or whatever. So I think it's like, I think sometimes there's a danger in this kind of conversation of like collapsing it as if magic is this one thing and Witchblood is this one thing, but I don't. I think it's super complicated, and I think we don't have a good vocabulary for talking about any of this in English, mostly because we spent most of the history of English murdering anyone who said any of this out loud.
I mean, there's definitely that. Although, so to speak on two things. One, I think it's interesting though, to even just to bring up Allison's amulets.
Mm-hmm.
So having witnessed Allison do magic,
Mm-hmm.
having done both various kinds of witchcraft and grimoire magic, lion skin belt and all, for my entire fucking life.
Mm-hmm.
It's fascinating to watch because you're looking at a woman plugging into the current of the grimoire system harder and more directly, and then being favored by spirits on top of that, and then channeling these abilities through her body. And that's a big thing, like, to use that as an example. It's one of the reasons why Alison's pentacles straight up work better than other people's pentacles. I have grown up around people who've made these. Alison's are by far the best that I have seen, especially now. But that's a whole thing where, like, you see the resonance of that in there. I would actually think it'd be funny to do a study. This is impossible to do, to see like the children of people who have purchased Alison's stuff if they come out special, because the radiation from them would probably do that. And if you look at like folklore about this, so like the Witchblood hurting people. Funny story, if you read fairy folklore and you look at 2003 Otherkin forums and you look at a lot of people who speak about like fairy magic today, you will see longitudinal trends of extraordinary health issues, short lives, weak bone density, and a lot of problems that make it look like their relationship to these spirits that often just don't do what you ask them to do anyway is just more of a curse than anything else. And outside of everyone's desire to like be a special fairy princess, the thing is that from what I have seen and what folklore has referenced comes at a cost. And the funny thing is, as much as I said I wasn't going to bring up the message board things, if you go in the Wayback Machine and you read a few, a lot of people are making shit up or psychotic, but there's that small group of people who all tell roughly the same story. And if you read, say, Lee Morgan's A Deed Without a Name, that story will be in like a one-to-one analog of like some of the interviews that he put in that book. And so you're like, yeah, people have always talked about this, but again, the frailty that comes with some of these things, the cost, because the implication is you're ensouled in this body if you're one of those for a short time and not a long time, and maybe it was a mistake, and probably you don't want to be here, because also every real fairy I've ever met has always either had outright suicidal ideation or this huge belief that they're going to return home as soon as they die, and they can't wait. Like it's there's no time soon enough to do that. And this is also often referenced in their dream lives, which if you look at some of these stories, go to the same fucking place. And again, if you follow the folklore in every culture that has a fairy equivalent, you'll see something to the effect of that. So I would argue that much like we all decided to put a sharp rock on the end of a stick to solve a problem, a lot of these things are universal, and you'll see analogs of some of them are really good. Like there are some kinds of witch blood that are just like a net benefit. It's like everything is amazing, your life is great, you can do a backflip, good for you. And some where it's like, well, you're special, but you probably wish you weren't. And actually, your life is terrible, and nobody wants to be you. Like that's so. There's that. That said, if you have purchased a practical occult amulet and have a weird kid, you're welcome.
But yeah, no, I think that in terms of your saying, like Allison's are better. My partner had asked about making pentacles and was like, "Can I make these without Witchblood?" I was like, "Yeah, but maybe they'd be better if you had it." Okay, well, if I made them and if I had Witchblood, is it better for me to do that, or is it better for me to just buy one from Practical Occult? I was like, well, Practical Occult, you have that combination of spirit relationships, Witchblood, experience making these, and them being really tested and shown they worked. So probably better to just buy one there. So not to like turn into like a commercial, but I think that that kind of illustrates that difference again of, yeah, lots of people can work these things. You can have an edge because you have something about you that gives you an edge, or you can have an edge because you've worked and developed an edge, or you can have an edge because you have both worked and you have that thing that makes you different. So I think it's like there's layers, and again, people don't always want to discuss this in layers, which I think is where people think it is more of a problem than it is. But also, like Allison, we just talked a bunch about your pentacles and stuff. Did you have any thoughts on any of these elements that we brought up?
Yeah, I think it's definitely important to say that there is training involved. It's not just something that like, you're born spooky and all of a sudden you're better than the best grimoire magician who has been practicing for 40 years or whatever, However, um, once I did get training and start reading books on magic and putting those things in practice, that was really the definitive change for me because earlier, I mean, I had the ability to like, sense energy and move energy around and, perceive things and sometimes push things to make them happen. But it was very something that was tied to my emotions and I wanted to be able to make things work um, for other people as opposed to pushing a situation that I was in at the time. um, and I really didn't get that until I got formal training. So I think that that's definitely something that people push back on about the whole idea of witch blood or witch fire, about the you just want to be born special and um, you know definitely training plays into it too to get to being good at things.
And I will testify that, like, having seen Alison do magic, but also having seen 20-year-old Alison do magic and also 40-year-old, like, Alison do magic, and same for me, right? But, like, you can watch the training, like, evolve in people as you observe their magic over time. Like, I agree. There's a natural talent for things, but just like anything else, like, just like if you're born a musical genius, you still do have to, like, learn how to music. And just like if you're good at math, you still have to learn math. Like magic the same way. Right. And that, like, I think a lot of it is about sort of matching your own natural gifts to like specific kinds of training. Both for like beginners, I think it's really important to like lean into what you're good at. But I also think that like as you evolve, it's important to lean into things you're bad at because that's how you improve at stuff, And like,
And,
I think, I don't know. I watch you guys all do that.
and I think like I agree with the importance of training.
Mhm.
I think that the question that people will ask then is like, okay, well, if you still got to train at it, what's the point of the witch blood thing? Like, is witch blood even a thing if like you still got to go train? I think the difference that probably all of us and other people who have this and have turned it into something where they've gone and trained as magicians is that before we found books or teachers, and I think Alex, you'd be probably the exception with the way your family was, that we were already doing magic and we had spirits that we already talked to, and those spirits already taught us magic, which is like the old school witch way of learning magic, as you learn it from spirits, not like necessarily from another witch or from a book. Um, but I think a lot of people they have that. Oh, I read fantasy books and I was interested in magic and I wanted to learn magic. And then I met someone who did magic, or I found a book on magic and then I started studying it and started doing it. And I think we all had that, oh, then I found a book on magic or I found a teacher and had that experience, but with already having a whole life of having done it and having been immersed in spirits and worked with spirits already. And I think that's when people kind of wonder about what the difference is and if there is a practical difference, that's part of it. Like somebody was in a forum the other day and was like, I'm a seventh generation witch and no one in my family is left to teach me anything. And my immediate response was, if you don't have spirits already talking to you and teaching you things, then coming from this as a you have witch blood doesn't really mean anything. It's like that's kind of one of the foundational fundamental things is that either there's going to be spirits or there's going to be things in nature, like things in the world that are talking to you and teaching you, and that those things that you're learning are actually applicable in ways that are usable. I guess unless you have like the really cursed beaten with a stick version of it where you're just broken and messed up and it's just not going to, and it's like you're just seeing spirits that are just leading you astray. But hopefully you don't have that. Hopefully people have the more adaptable version.
I mean, one certainly hopes. I don't know. I mean, for me, the funny question about like, well, if I'm not an immediate anime protagonist level powerful creature with Witchblood, like what's the point of it? I mean, again, it's aptitude versus training. I mean, Mike
Yeah.
Tyson, Iron Mike, one of the best boxers who ever lived, who I would argue was witch-blooded his dick because he loved pigeons like Nikola Tesla, but also the man was at least like 5 inches shorter than every opponent he knocked out and was frightening. Was extremely gifted at combat, but until he had a legendary coach, couldn't couldn't actualize even a fraction of his potential. Because, and that's the thing, like when you have someone, especially someone who has been where you are, especially a teacher who is similar to you, who can be like, I know what you're good at, I know what you're bad at because I'm the same or at least comparable. You know, that'll push you past where you could go because that person will go, yeah, I know that you slack off on this because I did, and I know that that's what you got. You shouldn't do it, and I know it sucks, and I know it's hard, but go ahead. But like, I think what's interesting about aptitude in this case, and the thing that I have observed that is the most common form of like aptitude oriented witch blood is like the guy I mentioned in the bar who like could manifest shit, right? Could just do that. And it's funny because um those people, they'll be normal people and they will think they're having bafflingly vivid daydreams, for example, about beating up the kid at school that they hate, and then that kid at school gets in a car accident.
Mhm.
Or they'll be working a job and they'll be like, I hate Rita over there, and I hope something bad happens to Rita, and then that exact thing happens, and it happens a baffling number of times, but that person kind of just rewrites history in their own brain, like,
Mhm.
oh well, things that I want to happen because the world is good, or because I'm just lucky, and I'm just very thankful that it happens. And interestingly enough, gratitude practice done right can be an offering to certain spirits that follow you. I would assume that there are plenty of people who are witch blooded as fuck, have familiars out the ass who never know until like the moment they die and they're surrounded by all these creatures and they're like, finally, it's you're here. Like
Mhm.
we helped you your whole life, and they're like, oh God, monsters! Like, like, am I in hell? I actually spoke to a ghost of a witch that is exactly what happened. She was like, I didn't know, and then you speak to her, and she's like, yeah, I really like to be embodied again. Can you help me find someone who wants to get pregnant, and I'll do something awesome for you. By the way, pro tip, those ghosts will work. They'll break their backs for you. Like, you
Mhm.
should absolutely hook them up because they'll hook you up. But truly, it's like, I mean, but even folklorically, the whole like, oh, the child in the village has the gift. Take them to the old woman at the edge of the village who also had the gift. And then, like, an antagonistic relationship becomes like a, student teacher, almost mother daughter relationship onward. That shit happens current, like present tense today. You
Oh,
will
for
see.
sure. I used to
Yeah.
teach high school and I have had those students and we had that
Oh,
relationship.
I absolutely believe it. But
100%.
also, like, if you look at like a conjure worldview, the idea of a witch, like a malevolent spellcaster, is still a thing.
Sure.
You go to Morgantown, West Virginia, and 2 hours a certain direction, you'll find a certain lady with a haint blue house who will walk around once every 3 years to schoolyards, and she'll find the bullied kid and she'll look, and if the kid has the gift, she'll go, okay, here's my phone number. You call me when the dreams start. And then, inevitably they do. And that's the thing. I mean, so like and I think that this is kind of a funny thing, like the like seeking like thing, because like I got an email the other day because I talk on podcasts a fair bit about how fortunate I've been to have a lot of instructors in my life. People will say like, well, how'd you do that? And I'm like, you have no idea how lonely we get. Like a few words of genuine, relatable, kind praise to the most evil sorcerer you've ever met is worth more than a mountain of gold. They will teach you everything because they are so, because the amount of them that feel insane, even though they know they're not, but cooped up in their home, especially if they're older than the internet, which fewer exist now. Every time an elder dies, a library burns.
Mhm.
But the connection they can make with you, and I truly entreat anybody who feels like giving this a shot, go to a small town nearby and ask who the witch is. They're not all going to have one, but eventually you're going to find one. And buy the witch a cup of coffee and just get him or her talking, and you will walk away with decades of training after like 4 hours at a Denny's. I'm just saying. Also, you'll make their day. They're all lonely and shit. Now, the fact that they'll appear in your dreams for years later, I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm saying it's effective.
All right, so I think probably good to touch on the next questions.
Forgot the
And
way it's
the next two actually kind of go together, even though we didn't group them together originally. One is, do you believe Witchblood is specifically genetic, or are there other possible mechanisms of heredity? And then the other one, where does Witchblood come from, both in terms of heredity and in terms of beginning of modern initiatory witchcraft?
I can't speak to modern initiatory witchcraft because I don't have any experience in a tradition that's could be considered modern in terms of witchcraft. The ones I'm in are quite old. Not that now caveat that doesn't mean they're better. That just means they're older. But where it comes from, in my opinion and experience, it comes from at some point in a lineage, either literally you or an ancestor, a spirit or a spiritual force mutated the etheric body of an individual person towards specific ends, weaponizing it um, towards a goal. For example, folklorically, angels have children with women, they create Nephilim. Nephilim die, they become Ryakim. Ryakim, reborn into humans, become witch-blooded creatures. Right? That's the thing you'll find throughout pretty much every kind of witch thing. It's considered by a lot of witches I've talked to be the most numerically common explanation for this because there were allegedly a shit ton of them. Now, again, can't prove that, but it gets one of those things like, inhuman spirit, reincarnated into human body, mutated etheric body. Human whose mother gets influenced by spirits or who owns one or six of Alison's pentacles, mutated etheric body. Person gets an initiation from a certain person, mutated etheric body during lived adulthood. I would argue that it's essentially in a radiation effect that changes a person, or they were already so other than human that when they incarnated in the human body, that changed it itself.
Yeah, I think for me, I would say that where you're hitting on that it's all about like changes in their etheric body or their soul or their spirit. That for me is part of why I don't like thinking of it as genetic, as like a DNA thing. Because like everybody, when they want to criticize this, they're like, "Oh, where's the witch gene? Like, where are you going to find this in DNA sequencing?" It's like, well, for the most part, it's like we aren't far enough along, even if it was a DNA thing, to be able to spot that. But I don't think it is. I think I pretty much agree with you that it has to do with some sort of interaction with spirits of the spirit world that changes the shape of a thing, makes someone sort of chimerical, breaks apart pieces of them and puts them back together in a weird way. And that sort of difference, that combination of pieces that don't entirely fit, is part of what creates that capacity and creates that change. Um, and that you can either inherit that, like somebody down the line had that in your family, or you can go out and get yourself fucked up and either have pieces of other things grafted onto you or have deep enough interactions that are intimate enough with spirits that it changes the shape of you. And then that becomes something that's passable at that point. I think there's also certain conditions that can just cause that to happen in a person, extraordinary birth conditions, where I don't know if it's that spirits are involved in those extraordinary birth conditions or something about the nature of the spirits of those times or those places, or whatever it is that causes them, that those act upon a child born at those times. But it's something that can be spontaneously generated in those ways as well. And there's a lot of folklore and a lot of cultures about that. Um, but I think it also gets the idea that there may be different ways that this happens as well. So like you could have things where it's like the having angel blood or fairy blood or something like that. But you could also have something where it's like there is a spirit that is attached to your family through some sort of curse or some sort of thing that happened that caused a relationship and a link where there's almost like an inheritable familiar spirit. Um, and sometimes that causes a relationship where there's a shift in the etheric body as opposed to just there's this spirit that follows your family around. So I think it can come from a lot of different places. I don't think it has to operate the same way for everyone or it has to have the same source for everyone. I think that kind of fits into the nice, neat, tidy fairy tale fantasy novel world. If it's like everyone, it's exactly the same and there's an easy explanation for it all the time. But I don't think that's true. I think there's lots of things that are very similar across different cultures that show that this is a phenomenon that happens throughout the world. But I think those different cultures, many of them have very similar explanations, but some of them have slightly different ones. And I think that shows that there's several ways that you can get to a place that looks very similar in a practical sense, but the actual mechanism of what's happening or what caused it might be slightly different. I'm in the same boat as you as far as modern initiatory traditions. To me, because witchcraft is something that you have and something that, and witch is something that you are, it's not about having a constructed tradition that humans have put together to pass along to other humans. It's about having the capacity to interact with spirits in a certain way and interact with the world and the current of forces in the world in a certain way. And you can build structures for doing that, but having a specific tradition of these are the practices and these are the initiations for that. I feel like that tends to be where it's like you're almost always hitting like a sort of religious structure, which to me is really different from witchcraft. And so I don't have a lot of experience with like the modern traditional witchcraft variants that would do something like this. Um, which I think those are interesting questions about how it works in those contexts where they're seeking to create it or they're seeking to amp it up in people who have it, but it's a little bit dormant. But I haven't been in traditions that do that. I only have sort of outsider familiarity with them, so I can't answer where they get them from either.
Yeah. So I agree mostly with everything both of you said. I will say, like, to me, the idea that it is like a deformation, I don't even want to say deformation, is a like change in the etheric body, I do not in any way find incompatible with the idea of it being genetic. Like, I do think there's a genetic component. And just like I can't look in someone's brain and identify like a gene for schizophrenia, that does not negate the fact that schizophrenia is indeed like a propensity for it is highly genetic and inheritable, but that there are also all these other factors. And I also think that, like, I can't speak for other like witch blooded people or whatever, but for me personally, like, I think it's a combination of factors. Like, I was born dead and my mother died and then was revived while having me. I think that maybe is relevant. But also, it was not until I was an adult that I learned that many people in my father's family can hear the dead, and they just understand that to be some kind of like devilly curse and they don't talk about it. And also, like, I definitely have a marked propensity towards visionary experiences, both in the sense of like grandiose artists and schizophrenics in my mother's line. And I think like those things all come together. So I think even in an individual person, it's normally like a combination of factors. And also, like, as a witch, I can point at specific things in my life where, like, oh yeah, I got extra witched when that happened, right? And some of those are in, I mean, I don't, let me think about how to say this. I have yet personally to encounter any kind of initiatory experience that is either like entirely like modern or entirely traditional. Like, all the traditions with which I interact exist in the modern world in a modern form, which is different than historic forms. And similarly, all the like modern, like neo-pagan or Wiccan or whatever like forms that I am interacting with all do have some kind of historical antecedent in them that are like mixed together. So I don't think it's so easy to. I think I've now answered every question with, well, it's complicated. So sorry.
It
I think
inevitably
it
would
is.
be. I will say though, in terms of the genetic component, I don't see any reason why it couldn't be. And I also don't see any reason why witching experiences couldn't change that. Because if we accept that healing magic works, if we accept that congenital conditions can be destroyed with a blasting rod or a purba, which they can, if we accept the miraculous nature of magic, we can accept that a person's genetic code could be changed by interacting with the spirit, which could then produce, if a witch gene exists, could then evidence that in a person. So I don't see any reason why it couldn't happen. I just don't know anything about genetics outside of watching the movie Gattaca too many times. So
so we know many things, like non-witchy things in the world alter genetics. Like that's a well understood.
Sure, yeah. Which so yeah, like I said, like that's, I don't see any reason why it couldn't be both, but also why you couldn't, because I think people's biggest issue with the conversation is everyone needs to, in these conversations that happen, broadly speaking, everyone wants to feel comfortable. Everybody wants to feel equally valid and special and important. And people don't want to hear, you have more work to do.
Right.
Even if, let alone you can't do this at all. But there are plenty of people, and I would argue most, who have a little bit, who can turn a little bit into a lot. I mean, I would argue the entire system of tantric sorcery turns a person into a witch. People don't want to have that conversation, but I think that they're fucking goofy for not wanting to have that conversation. But no, but that's the thing. I mean, you do Tumo for 45 minutes a day for 3 months, and you come back to me and tell me you're the same person. You're not gonna be. You do Franz Barden's letter magic for 4 years, and you come back to me and tell me you aren't now witchy as fuck because you've essentially spammed your etheric body and genetic system with so many cosmic forces that you fantastic forward yourself into something different, right? Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's just, you can do it. It just, you got to accept that there's more effort you got to put in, I suppose. That's I do like that even having this conversation, Franz Barden's rolling in his grave because I mentioned that his stuff can be used for anything besides, contemplating the mind of God. Mm-hmm. Oh, Franzi B, when I die and we're gonna have a conversation, it's gonna be great. We're gonna hang out, we're gonna party. You and me, you and me, buddy.
I think for me, the leaning away from the genetic answer is more just we don't have a way of tracking it at this point to prove it one way or another. So to me, whether it's genetic or not is not the answer to whether it's real or not. And
agreed.
Yeah, sure.
I think the point you make about how, like, if we accept that these other magic things are real, then that shows that we can make these sorts of changes. So why not this change? I think that's really part of the whole underlying conversation of, if people accept that magic is real and you can have these spirit relationships and these things that are changed by magic, then why would this not also be one of the things that happens due to magic?
When people love to cherry pick, that's the problem. I mean, they love to look at it like, oh, I love the history of magic. I read Agrippa. First of all, did you? Who actually read Agrippa the first time? I'm gonna tell you a secret. It wasn't me. I have since. But I'm just saying, it's like, but did you read Paracelsus? Did you actually? Did you? Because he says some weird shit. He says some shit that maybe vexes you a little bit. He says some shit that maybe says that this conversation has merit. But like, or like, again, looking at all of the read between the lines things just keeps proving it. For example, going back to my boy Franz Barden, Franzi B. At one point in his second book, he talks about like, oh yeah, you can fuck a mermaid. I mean, like, you shouldn't, but you can. But I wouldn't dare. But I'm going to tell you exactly how to do it, but you should never do it. Mm-hmm. It's like those witches over there are having orgies in the woods. You're like, that's terrible. Tell me exactly where that is so I can avoid it and go to church instead. But I need to know coordinates so that I can be good. It's like, because even Barden is like, oh yeah, if you do this, but your children will have water elemental souls, which will make them amazing at music and good singing voices, but they'll be emotionally unstable and da 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 da. I'm like, this is really specific, bro. Like, why did you talk about this for a page and a half of this book? Like, you really went in, and nobody would have even thought about this probably if you hadn't have brought it up. Now, why is that? Mm-hmm. So, like, I'm just saying, it's everywhere. But if we can accept that magic is, that's the thing, you can't just pick and choose the parts that you like. Or rather, you oughtn't to. People love to, but you oughtn't to. You can't be like, oh yeah, I like. Now, obviously, if something doesn't survive the pressure test of being realistic, Because, like, for example, grimoire enthusiast and other kinds of magic person, I can't levitate with the air element yet, and I can't make a demon make me fly yet. But I'm not saying it can't happen, but I haven't seen it happen.
Mhm.
That said, if everybody says the same shit, it's probably real. Because our ancestors weren't stupid.
Yeah.
They were the opposite of stupid.
I agree, especially when it's repeated like cross-culturally, like independent. You know what I mean? Like if everybody's just saying the same thing Agrippa says because everybody's pretending they read Agrippa, like I find that less confirmatory. But the way it exists cross-culturally, and sometimes it's not obvious that things are the same until you kind of like see that big picture view. But once you do, I 100% agree.
Anyone else have anything they want to tack onto that before we move to the next questions? Okay, so the next questions move us into like our kind of second grouping of topics. And so again, what was it?
I just saw Allison's mute turn off for a second. So I want to make sure we did next
thing. It's fine. We can move on.
Oh, no, Allison, like if you wanted to throw something in, it'd be great to hear some more from you.
I was just going to say that Sarah's mention of as an adult finding out that family members were spookier than she was told earlier. I kind of had a similar situation where I got to be in the full adult and then had to come out of the broom closet to tell my family, hey, this is my profession now. And then and I was expecting a different reaction, and instead I got well, it turns out your family is spookier than you thought, and my grandmother apparently used to experience ghosts, and my great grandmother knew when relatives were dead, even if no one had notified the family yet. And my mom used to astral project when she was young, and just all this other stuff. So it's one of those things where, and also I did grow up Protestant, so that's probably part of the cultural suppression there. It's one of those things where just because you don't know that you have a family history of it doesn't mean that you didn't.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, because a lot of people just won't talk about it. You know what I mean? Or they'll tell everyone everything on their deathbed. I have seen that. Not in my own family, because my own family was fairly candid about a lot of things. But I have been on the deathbeds of people in my life for various circumstances, and they're like, there's an angel that followed me. I remember one woman said there was an angel that followed me, and he was actually the man I loved my whole life, and my children look like him. And and I'm going back and I can see him, and you're like, oh, that's adorable. But also, and then if you're my spooky ass, you turn around and you do see a figure, and you're like, oh shit, you're not even fucking lying. Oh my god, that shit is right there, and it is big as hell. Wow, okay, I'm gonna stand over here, sir, because you are large. Like, fucking. But like, there are people who will hold that shit right here for their whole lives, and then at the end, or like you read someone's diaries after they're dead, and you're like, damn, you lived a whole double life on the astral, didn't you? You were just fucking around. That said, the angel kids, by the way, witch-blooded as fuck. I'm just
Well, that actually I think is kind of a good segue into our next set of questions.